Hey everyone, in this recipe we're trying something new and we're going to get to bread mistakes and how you can spot them while baking. In this recipe, I tried to make a sandwich loaf and it didn't really work out, and I'm going to show you some moments where I went wrong. So in a bowl, I added some agave nectar, and then I kind of just eyeballed the sourdough starter and dumped it in, even though I weighed it and I added just a bit too much. 80 grams of sourdough starter is normally the base that I enjoy using. If not, it gets pretty overactive. I didn't adjust my water accordingly, and I added about 50 grams more water than usual, and it actually provided too much hydration to the dough than I would have previously wanted to. Also, I added sugar instead of salt because I added ingredients that I wasn't familiar with because they were in different jars here in our apartment in Spain, and I ended up adding more sweetener to a recipe that already had agave nectar in it. So when you add additional sugars to any sort of yeast, whether commercial or sourdough, it normally activates the fermentation process a lot. So as we will see in just a little bit, this created an overactive yeast in addition to already adding way too much yeast. During the autolyse stage, things seemed okay. They didn't seem like the dough was overactive quite yet, so I added my normal stretch and folds until at this moment I noticed that the gluten was not developing very well. There were large pockets inside of the folds that I was trying to do and within the outer layers of the gluten, and I kind of just kept going hoping that it would be okay. And honestly, this kind of bread, I'm gonna be totally frank, it doesn't look good, may not taste good, but still edible, as we'll see at the very end. Another mistake. So typically when I bake sandwich bread in a sandwich loaf pan, I just add a little bit of spray oil, no parchment paper. But recently when I was in Tucson, just adding spray oil was making the bread stick to the pan. So I did parchment paper and oil, and as we'll see at the end again, the bread stuck to the parchment paper. So I actually recommend using flour instead of oil. I don't know if folks out there have better methods, but sometimes when I just use a loaf pan, when I'm not using a batard or I'm not cooking in a Dutch oven, it gets a little tricky to get it out of the pan. Once again, as I'm starting to shape the dough, I can tell from the outer layer of the dough that it's starting to break. And here when I'm trying to create tension before I shape the dough into a sandwich, the very top has these little holes where you can tell that the gluten is actually breaking as I'm trying to add tension to the dough. And this is a really good indicator that the yeast is over fermented. So ultimately, I decided to keep running with it, hoping and crossing my fingers that the bread would work out. I flattened it, I degassed it, and I wanted to shape it into a sandwich bread. And this is another moment where I was like, darn, this gluten is insalvageable. By rolling the dough into a sandwich dough, which is kind of a typical baguette sort of tubular shape, the outer edges were starting to break, and you can tell if you pay close attention to the dough that it doesn't hold its shape, rather it sort of breaks and wants to become this sort of lumpy mass. Not ideal at all. You can kind of get the rough shape to hold. You can try and bake it, but as you'll see, the fermentation process made the outside crumb look very strange. For this dough, I wanted to really try my best to save it, and I wanted to bake it. I mean, I had already spent all this time in trying to make the bread anyway, that I proved it overnight, hoping that the cold temperature would slow the fermentation down and create some gluten. The following day, though, the crust looked like this, and you could tell that it was once again overproofed, not enough gluten development, the same recurring themes that have been appearing since the beginning of this video, but I decided, why the hell not, let's bake it anyway. I baked it at 450 for 40 minutes, and the top, you can already tell what I'm talking about, the sort of lack of structure. But the worst bit was when I tried to take the bread out of the parchment paper. It had completely stuck, and this is one of my biggest pet peeves. It's happened to me many times in the past when I'm trying to bake things. It's because I simply just don't add flour, and flour tends to work much better. I would just go with that. You don't even really need the parchment paper sometimes. So I ended up with a loaf that was edible. You just don't need that parchment paper. And here are some just recurring overview of the mistakes that I made. And sometimes it's good to share mistakes. So if you guys like this video, be sure to subscribe. It would mean the world. I'll leave more information in the description as to what went wrong. And if you found this helpful at all, I hope that you stay tuned for more in the following week. See you next time.